Professor, I have a question.
Yeah.
Are we focusing more on the Move documentary or the Wall Street documentary?
I think they're both, right? So the question is as far as the material as a whole. And I think within both films, you can find self-determination and self-sufficiency. So either or.
Oh, okay. Can I speak on the one from the
Please.
Wall Street documentary?
Mhm.
Okay, so for me, like obviously the whole situation was that um the mob, like the white mob basically created a whole riot in the neighborhood. And because of that, the community was burned down. Like there was a loss of lives, loss of economy too. And then I believe I didn't get their names, but in the documentary it said that the not the council members, but you know the people in charge
Mhm.
of the Tulsa community, they were like they were white men and they were like, oh, we will help like reconstruct this community. And then it turns out that obviously this whatever money they were putting into it was going to be for their own advantage, and not actually for the advantage of the Black community who had originally built this community for themselves. And it was actually a community that had doctors, that had lawyers, that like they built themselves up. And to have that all destroyed and then to have like this white, like I guess, savior in a way, they were like, no, because they were just gonna perpetuate their own agenda. So they instead, like, we talk about resilience. So they showed their resilience again by saying, no, we're not gonna take that. And I think it was a lawyer, I forgot his name, but a Black lawyer who really like went into research, like researching, I guess, what they were actually, the white men were
Mhm.
planning to do. And they was like, no, this isn't okay. So instead they decided to like build it up again for themselves, no matter the cost. So yeah.
Thank you, Nolani. Anyone else want to speak to the role of terrorism, or were they able to identify terrorism within the materials? And again, we talk about either the Move movement or Black Wall Street. All that's on the table.
Uh, I think acts of terrorism were seen in like the police department on how they went about like handling and like treating others, and the the fact that innocent people were involved as well, kind of shows like their carelessness, and then the extreme measures that they take were just like too much, especially like within it's we're not talking about like a real threat. We're talking about people who are doing that for progression. And even in like modern society, progression can be seen as a threat. And instead of like working and collaborating and finding a like middle ground, they just want to take over and just, show dominance. And that's an act of terrorism, in my opinion.
Good call out, Kevin. Thank you. Anyone else want to speak to the role of terrorism within the material? And if not, we could talk about what stood out to you most. Go ahead,
Can
John.
you say that one more time?
Whatever stood out to you first, or we're discussing the role of terrorism within the material. But Gianna, go ahead.
I'd like to speak out about what stood out to me about the Black Wall Street documentary. How a lot of people don't know about this event, and that has to do with how news and media outlets and white people in the community were trying to pretend like it didn't happen, and that's not how it should be. And a lot of people were not honored, those that had died, because they were trying to not have memorials and just not talk about it, which is horrendous, horrifying. And I was shocked to hear that it was just like 18 hours that like that's ridiculous. Like, horrible.
Anyone else want to share what stood out to them?
Something that stood out to me was on the longer documentary. It seems that white Americans have continued to just remold. It's kind of like a reduce, reuse, recycle. This idea of like racial institutions.
Mhm.
They've just done it kind of in different forms, whether it be like Jim Crow laws, plantations, or now like in prisons. So they've done like for lack of a better term, a good job of like hiding the fact that slavery is still alive today and racism like hasn't ended. They've just kind of meshed it into the media to make it seem like, oh, sending someone to prison or someone to jail is like a justice thing or it's a good thing, but it's not. Yeah, I mean, you're just because it's all a setup. It seems. And then I found that another thing that stood out to me was kind of that same setup by when Ronald Reagan was in power of the drug war. Instead, like they made lab created drugs that were easy to access and targeted Black communities. And I mean, yeah, anybody who was minoritized that way would fall under that same trap.
So what I'll do for the brief time that we have, right, is kind of provide a context of how last week's material bleeds into this week's material. So this notion of self-determination and self-sufficiency, right? We talked about how this was a core pillar of the United Negro Improvement Association in the work of Marcus Garvey, right? So much so, in fact, that they warned Carter G. Woodson about taking money from white philanthropists because they're going to control how you go about your historical work. Keep in mind this temporal aspect. The height of the Marcus Garvey movement takes place in 1920, right? This is he has the largest demonstration of his organization. The very next year, right, we have the Tulsa massacre. The very next year, 1921. So we have to be able to make those connections in the sense that we don't want to separate those two movements, right? Because the values that you see within the Garvey movement is manifested in what you know as Black Wall Street, right? They did what Garvey talked about. And not to say that Garvey didn't do these things, but they implemented his plan at a very high level, right? To the point that they were able to begin conversations around trading with other countries, as was mentioned, right? So a year between the demonstration of the Garvey movement and then the destruction of Black Wall Street. Also, let's not confuse this, right? Absolutely, the financial well-being of the Black community and Black Wall Street cause, envy, cause jealousy, cause hate. Like, I'm not diminishing that, right? But we also should be attentive to the fact that Black Wall Street and the MOVE movement met the same fate, right? So the MOVE movement did not amass no large amount of wealth, right? In fact, the MOVE movement was about disavowing materialism, disavowing capitalism, and detaching yourself from the system. Almost the antithesis of what Black Wall Street did. So be clear, right? The desire to be self-determined is what brought the fate of bombing to both Black Wall Street and the MOVE movement. We do know that the first domestic bombing, right? The first time the United States bombed itself was Black Wall Street. Think about this. The first time the United States bombed itself was the bombing of Black Wall Street. The second time that it took place was in the 1980s in South Philly for the MOVE movement, right? When they set the row houses on fire. So again, whether you're trying to amass wealth or you're trying to detach from wealth and materialism, the powers that be are going to respond to you in kind. Another form of... Go ahead.
I was just gonna make a note on that, like around the same lines you're talking about, this idea of like self-determination. Something that stood out to me in the longer argument, I believe his name was, I searched it, was Omali Yeshiteli, one of the speakers. And just to those lines that you're speaking of, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says that neocolonialism comes about as a symptom of the masses becoming too astute and recognize that there's obvious domination. So going back to kind of the movement or Black Wall Street, yeah, the moment they became self-determined and started getting like that sense right away, they noticed, oh, we need to shut this down because there's too much power there.
Absolutely. And I also want to point out this form of terrorism, right? Lynchings. Lynchings were very prevalent at this time as well. But oftentimes the excuse, and I'm going to put tremendous air quotes on the excuse was the attempt to rape or harm white women, right? But that's not often the real reason for the lynching. In fact, you attach, if you do a deep research and a deep investigative dive into the lynchings of the American past, you find that the majority of the people who were lynched in these times were business owners. They were business owners whose businesses competed with their white counterparts. In fact, Ida B. Wells, who is the founder of the anti-lynching movement, a Black woman, right? She begins this movement because her good friend was lynched because his convenience store outsold the white convenience store that was across the street, right? So let me ask you this. What was the excuse for the burning of Black Wall Street? What was the incident that took place that they said caused all the destruction? Takes place in the elevator. Does anybody remember? Go ahead, Gianna.
I believe it was a white woman claiming that a young African American man had sexually assaulted her in the elevator, which was ridiculous.
Right. So essentially what happens, right? The elevator begins to move. He stumbles, he bumps into her, and she claims that's sexual assault, right? And this is the impetus behind them beginning to go through the act of rioting and burning down the town. But we know on closer analysis, that was just a Trojan horse, right? That was just a proxy for them to go on and do what they really wanted to do, which was destroy the wealth of the town, right? So again, this is why I'm bringing up the reality that oftentimes the assault of white women is used as a proxy to destroy the economic power base of Black folks. And again, I give you the example of Ida B. Wells' good friend who was lynched because of the prominence of his business. James Baldwin, who we'll read towards the end of the semester, also talks about this very predominantly in the sense that the economics is what caused a lot of the Black folks in these times to be lynched. But again, to even complicate that, right, we know even for the movement, they weren't about the economics. That wasn't what their thrust was, but they met the same fate, right? So this is something to be taken into consideration. I want to say it was also Gianna who pointed out the white elites of the town, the white leaders of the town said, we're going to come in and rebuild this and restore what was lost, right? Never happened, right? But this is an historical thing that has taken place since the beginning of time as it pertains to African and European relations, right? One can argue that the act of destroying something and saying that we'll build it up and never doing so, that's the impetus for what we know as gentrification, right? Because isn't that the same way that it plays out? Except they don't use bombs to clear the folks out, right? They'll build a stadium, hence what's happening in Inglewood, right? Hence Chavez Ravine, which was a thriving indigenous community before they cleared them out to build Dodger Stadium, right? So these same type of things take place. If we are to go back further, think back to the reading on the destruction of Black civilization, right? They came into their town, moved them out of their town, and made the conditions inhabitable for them to be in their own area. Is that not the axiom, is not that the radix point of gentrification? Does it not play out the same way? So when Filberto talks about how they just kind of evolve these tactics, this is an example of that. It's the same shit. They just go through more extreme measures to make these things happen back in the day, right? They'll get in their airplanes and drop a bomb on cities. I think that's fascinating to think that in the 1920s, I believe it was like over 5 private jets in that small town. Like, do y'all know how much fucking gas it takes to fly a PJ? And we're talking about in the 1920s. And then to think about this idea that I believe they say by 2045, the average household income in the Black family, what do you think that they're projecting it will be? The average household income in a Black family, what is the projected income? What do you think? Nobody?
You said 2040 what?
2045.
Shit. Probably like 80K. Low as hell. Lower?
Zero. The average projected income for the Black household by 2045 is projected to be zero. I understand, Gianna. I understand, Julian. But this is what they're projecting. Now, we can look at this one of two ways. We can look at it from a deficit perspective and say, oh man, Blacks don't have the ability to manage their money. This is why it will be zero. They like to buy, as Trump says, shoes, right? Or we can look at history and see how the powers that be have made vast attempts to ensure that the accumulation and sustaining of Black wealth does not happen. Do you understand the idea of how a dollar circulates? You understand this concept? So for those who don't, I get my check, right? When I go to spend my money, chances are for the Black community, you spend your money outside of the Black community. So for example, I get my check, I go to buy groceries. Do I go to a Black grocery store to buy groceries? If I do, where that at? Somebody tell me where that's at so I could go do it. But I don't know where one is, so I have to get my groceries outside of my community. Does this make sense? When I go to buy my clothes and things of that nature, typically Black-owned businesses aren't owning these clothing shops. So I give my money outside of my community. So what they're arguing is, at this rate, the Black dollar does not circulate one time. So if the Black dollar does not circulate, then that's going to minimize the ability for the Black family to earn income. They're looking at things like employment rates for Black folks, prison rates for Black folks, houselessness rates for Black folks, right? And these are the things that give them the projection that the household income will be zero. I believe California is less than 6% Black, but we make up 80% Black men, 80% of the homeless population. Think about that. Less than 6%, and we make up 80% of the homeless population. You already know the figures in prison. So these are the reasons as they estimate zero income. For Wednesday, we will continue this conversation, but I ask that you read the Malcolm X and Ghana speech. We're going to combine those two conversations for Wednesday's reading. So we'll finish this today. We'll finish what we just started today, but I'm asking you that you also read the Malcolm X and Ghana piece, and we'll pick that up on Wednesday. Any last minute questions, comments, or concerns? All right, y'all. I got to run. I got to get my kids. I will see you all on Wednesday. Peace.